Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us in another story from long ago. Tell me if you'd like. Where are you listening from? And what time is it right now? But what was the craziest part of Viking funerals? While most of their contemporaries in Europe were getting a simple Christian burial in the 8th to 11th centuries, not only was this boat larger than most Viking ships, it had 2 floors, but it also had a gruesome secret. In the bottom floor, holes were cut in the sides of the ship for the oarsmen to row. For example, the Oseberg ship was one of the largest and most intricately carved Viking vessels ever discovered. It was initially thought that the ship had been used for a funeral. Well, not really, but it did feature a royal pig assassination. Okay, let me explain. Olaf was a legendary Viking king who ruled from 941 to 981. He was known for his wisdom, bravery, and ability to throw a mean party. So when he died, his funeral was appropriately epic. First, his body was placed on a ship with all of the traditional burial goods, such as food, drink, and weapons. Then the ship set sail for the nearest island, where Olaf's remains were burned on a massive funeral pyre. But this was no ordinary funeral pyre. It was 125 feet tall and made entirely of solid silver. Yes, you heard that right. A 125-foot tall silver tower was constructed on the island, and Olaf's body was burned within it. The ashes were then collected and placed in a burial mound, where they supposedly remained for 3 days before being dispersed by the wind. While this story may sound like an exaggeration, it's actually pretty believable. The Vikings were known for their skill in metalworking, and a wealthy king like Olaf would have had no trouble commissioning a giant silver pyre. In fact, archaeologists have discovered several examples of Viking funeral pyres, and some of them were quite elaborate. For example, the Boar Mound in Denmark contains the remains of a massive pyre that was built on top of a stone platform. The platform had been decorated with intricate carvings, and the pyre itself had been surrounded by a ditch and a fence. Clearly, the Vikings knew how to throw a funeral bash. But no Viking funeral was more lavish than that of King Olaf. Halfdan was a Viking warrior and the father of King Harald Fairhair, the first king of United Norway. After Halfdan died in battle in 867 AD, his son Harald honored his father by building him a massive burial mound at a place called Myklebust. The mound was so big that it was clearly visible from afar, and according to legend, Harald continued to add to the mound for years, piling up so much dirt that it eventually formed a hill. But that wasn't all. Harald also buried a pig in the grave, except this wasn't just any pig. It was a royal pig that had been specially selected for the occasion, and pigs were often sacrificed in Viking funerals, but this one was destined for greatness. After the burial, Harald invited a bunch of thugs to the grave and challenged them to a drinking contest. Whoever drank the most ale without falling over would receive the title of best drinker in Norway. And if that sounds like a bunch of nonsense, well, it is. But the real reason for the drinking contest was to appease the dead Halfdan. You see, Vikings believed that their dead ancestors could bring them good fortune if they were properly honored. So by throwing a massive party at the grave, Harald was essentially saying, "Hey, Dad, I'm doing everything I can to make you proud." Now, whether or not Halfdan actually approved of his son's shenanigans is unknown, but if he didn't show it. After Harald became king, he continued to build on the family legacy by conquering much of Norway and establishing a strong monarchy. He also kept the party going by hosting many more drinking contests, probably with less pig assassination. But the presence of food remains on board suggests that it was instead used for a feast. However, when it was discovered that the ship contained the graves of a woman and 2 of her servants, it became clear that the burial had taken a bizarre turn. The servants had been laid to rest with expensive jewelry and their fingernails painted red, suggesting that they had been high-status individuals. But that wasn't all. The entire ship had been carefully covered with soil, indicating that it had been intended as a burial mound. While we don't know exactly what happened on board the Oseberg, we do have some clues as to why the ship was chosen as a final resting place. According to the Orkneyinga saga, a Norwegian text written in the 13th century, the ship had belonged to a queen named Oseberg, who had died after falling off the horse while hunting. The saga goes on to tell the story of how the king was so distraught by his wife's death that he ordered her to be buried with all of the treasures she had been wearing at the time of her death. It is possible that the discovery of the Oseberg ship and its occupants is related to the events described in the saga, but we'll never know for sure. But these holes were also designed to trap people inside. Warriors were often laid to rest with weapons and treasure, while ordinary people received simpler grave goods, such as clothing or jewelry. Sometimes the graves were quite elaborate, featuring multiple chambers and even false roofs to prevent grave robbers from desecrating the site. In other cases, the bodies were simply placed in shallow graves with little or no ceremony. But no matter how elaborate or simple the burial, each grave was carefully planned to ensure that the deceased would be comfortable in the afterlife. While the practice of burying the dead with possessions is common in many cultures, the sheer scale and opulence of some Viking burials is truly remarkable. For example, the Hoard burial at the Sutton Hoo site in England contains the remains of an Anglo-Saxon nobleman and his retinue, along with a vast array of grave goods. These include over 2,000 objects ranging from weapons and armor to jewelry and personal items such as combs and tweezers. The presence of such items indicates that the Vikings believed that the dead would need everything they had in life to be comfortable in the afterlife. While we can't know for sure what the Vikings believed about the afterlife, their burial practices provide us with a fascinating glimpse into their culture and beliefs. Once the ship sailed from its dock, an unsuspecting group of oarsmen realized they were trapped in a floating coffin. That's because their captain, a man named Ragnar Lothbrok, had locked them in the ship's hull along with his body. As the boat drifted away, the men inside clawed at the walls until they suffocated, adding a horrifying new meaning to the phrase, "Rest in pieces." While Ragnar's remains were eventually found, some of his crew were never recovered, making this the first recorded case of a Viking ship burial gone wrong. Vikings had full-on death rituals that would make the god Odin himself proud. But who knows? Maybe Odin was just like, "Yawn, another Tuesday?" Comment below and let us know in comment section. Now let's begin. There's little evidence that Vikings commonly practiced this type of burial. Most archaeological evidence suggests that cremations were reserved for smaller vessels, such as those used by fishermen. Larger ships like longships were much more likely to be buried in the ground, although sometimes they took an unexpected turn. One example is the burial mound at the Birka site in Sweden. While excavating the site in the 1960s, archaeologists discovered the remains of a ship that had been buried beneath the mound. The ship was so large that it had been deliberately cut in half in order to fit inside. It was also filled with 500 artifacts, including swords, axes, and jewelry. But perhaps even more surprising was the discovery of human remains, which may indicate that the ship had been reused for multiple burials over time. This practice of reusing ships for multiple burials was more common than previously thought, with at least 5 other sites in Scandinavia showing similar characteristics. When Vikings weren't busy pillaging, they were dying. And when they did die, they went out with a bang. Sometime around the year 800, a ship was being built in Norway for a very special passenger. While there are many famous tales of Vikings going out in a blaze of glory, usually by burning to death in their boats, some of the most impressive Viking burial ships were never meant to be buried at all. In addition to ships, Vikings also buried their dead with the items they would need in the afterlife. The grave of the Halfdan the Black in Norway was so important that it had its own zip code. But no Viking funeral was more epic than the funeral of King Olaf X of Norway. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Welcome to my channel. And today we shall take a look at some of the craziest death rituals ever, specifically those of the Vikings. The Vikings were known for their extreme acts of violence. They pillaged, they raided, and they loved a good fight. But what they wouldn't do is leave any opportunity for going overboard. And that's exactly how it was when one of them died. It didn't matter if it was a Viking warrior who died in battle. Well, sometimes they were sacrificed too. It wasn't uncommon for Vikings to sacrifice slaves along with their dead. They also had a strong sense of honor and tradition. Sometimes the Vikings would sacrifice animals during the funeral. They believed that the dead person would need sustenance for the journey to the afterlife. Yes, you heard that right. A ship. During a funeral in the 9th century, a Viking ship was sailing out to sea with the body of a dead chieftain on board. She died in the 9th century and was buried in a ship burial in Scotland. Archaeologists discovered her skeleton in 1839 and found that she had been buried with an array of riches. The burial included more than 100 pieces of jewelry, dozens of weapons, and even a small fortune in silver coins. Lady Findhor was clearly a very important person, but we don't know much about her. The Vikings didn't keep written records, so everything we know about them comes from archaeological evidence. Unfortunately, this means that we don't know much about Lady Findhorn or any of the other Vikings who were buried with such riches. The ship was filled with the chieftain's possessions, including his weapons, jewelry, and other valuables. They would burn entire villages, sacrifice slaves and animals, and bury their dead with their entire fortunes. But these rituals weren't just barbaric and wasteful. They were an important part of Viking culture and society. The Vikings believed that the way they treated their dead would determine how they would be treated in the afterlife. So they went to great lengths to honor and appease their gods. And to be honest, who wouldn't want to live in a world where people are willing to go to such extremes to honor their gods? It must have been pretty scary. As the ship was sailing, a storm suddenly appeared out of nowhere and capsized the vessel. Everyone on board, including the dead chieftain, was thrown into the sea. The survivors managed to right the ship and retrieve the body of the chieftain, but it was too damaged to continue the voyage. They ended up having to abandon the ship and bury the chieftain on land instead. To say that this burial was a failure would be a horrific understatement. So they would leave enough food and drink to sustain them on their journey. This was especially common when a large group of Vikings died in battle. In these cases, they would gather the bodies and hold a mass funeral. Sometimes they would even bury their enemies, along with their own people. This was done as a way of showing respect to the dead, regardless of who they fought for. They believed that everyone deserved a proper burial, no matter what side they were on. Sometimes they would even leave special meals that the dead person had requested before they died. But that wasn't all. Yes, you heard that right. A fortune. In the year 973, a Viking named Erik Bloodaxe died and was buried in a massive mound in Norway. Archaeologists discovered the mound in 1834 and began excavating it. They found the skeleton of Erik Bloodaxe and a huge treasure hoard buried with him. The treasure included more than 600 silver coins, dozens of pieces of jewelry, and several weapons. Erik Bloodaxe was a wealthy and powerful Viking, and it seems like he wanted to take all of his possessions with him to the afterlife. Who knows? Maybe he thought he could use them to buy his way into Valhalla. The Vikings also believed that the dead person would need weapons to defend themselves on their journey to the afterlife. That is why they would often bury the dead person with their weapons and armor. They believed that the weapons would help the dead person fight off evil spirits and other dangers that they may encounter on their journey, either by burning them alive or by throwing them into the grave. They believed that the animals would guide the dead person's soul to the afterlife, so they were considered an important part of the burial. However, not all Vikings were okay with animal sacrifices. In fact, Many saw it as a waste of life and an unnecessary part of a funeral. Despite this, though, animal sacrifices continued throughout much of Viking history. When one of them died, they would hold a funeral feast that could last for days. During the feast, they would drink and fight and tell stories about the dead person. After the feast, they would bury the body and all of its possessions in a mound. The mound was usually built over a wooden boat, and the body would be placed inside the boat with all of its weapons, jewelry, and other belongings. The Vikings believed that when the body was burned, the soul would be released. That is why they would place the body in such a grand way, so that the soul could be set free, especially if the dead person was important. For example, when King Olaf the White died in 1003, he was buried with 68 slaves. They believed that the slaves would serve the king in the afterlife, so they were considered a valuable part of the burial. However, not all Vikings were okay with sacrificing slaves. In fact, many saw it as a barbaric practice. Those who were against sacrificing slaves argued that it was unnecessary and that it was cruel to kill innocent people. Despite this, though, sacrificing slaves continued throughout much of Viking history. A chief who had ruled over his people for decades, or even a slave. When one of them died, there was only one way to go. The body would be burned, along with all of their worldly possessions. And it wasn't just the dead person's belongings. Their entire village could be burned down. Yes, you heard that right. The entire village. That doesn't sound like something that would happen unless the village was harboring a dragon or something. So let me explain. The Vikings practiced a religion called heathenry, which was based around honoring and appeasing the gods. These gods included Thor, Odin, and Loki, among others. In order to honor these gods, the Vikings would hold feasts, and they would invite the gods to come and join them. One time, however, the god Loki showed up late to one of these feasts. The Vikings did not take kindly to this, and decided to punish him by locking him inside an iron chest until he agreed to leave. This is where things got messy. As soon as Loki left, the Vikings set fire to the feast hall and killed everyone inside, including the god Thor. The next day, the Vikings found Loki's body and cut it into pieces. They then burned each piece separately and threw the ashes into the sea. And that is why the Vikings began to burn villages as a way of honoring their gods. But what about the slaves? However, even though the Vikings were known for their extreme acts of violence, now, as I said before, the Vikings were known for their extreme acts of violence, and that extended to their funerals as well. Another thing that the Vikings would do during their funerals was to leave food and drink offerings for the dead person. Now, if you think that's crazy, wait till I tell you about the time that a Viking ship was sunk during a funeral. Another crazy thing about Viking funerals was that they would sometimes bury multiple people at once. If you think that's crazy, wait till I tell you about the time that a Viking was buried with his entire fortune. One of the most famous Viking burials ever discovered was that of a woman named Lady Findorn. Overall, the Vikings had some of the craziest death rituals ever. Thank you for watching. Don't die in the Viking Age. These guys had some of the craziest death rituals ever. In today's video, we are going to take a look at two of their weirdest. Horses and dogs were buried alongside the dead, and stones were arranged in ship shapes for land burials. So let's get into it. The Vikings treasured horses more than most things. They were used for transportation, food, war, and even religious rituals. It wasn't unusual for a person to own between 30 and 60 horses in the 9th and 10th century. And the bond between man and horse was so strong that when a Viking died, he would often be buried with his favorite horse. In fact, mass graves have been found containing human remains and dozens of horses. One example is the grave at the Jelling Monument in Denmark, which contains the remains of a woman and around 30 horses. Another example is the famous Sutton Hoo burial in England, which dates back to the early 7th century and includes the remains of a man, 2 women, and 35 horses. But why did they do this? Well, it could be because horses were such an important part of their culture that they didn't want them to go to waste even in death. After all, the Vikings believed that the afterlife was a continuation of life on Earth, and they wanted their horses to be with them in the next world, just like they were in this one. Or it could be because they believed that horses could help guide their loved ones through the underworld. In fact, there are many tales of heroes being helped by supernatural horses when traveling through the underworld. For example, in the Norse myth about Odin's son, Balder, he travels to the underworld after being tricked by his blind brother Hodder and is met by a giant serpent who wants to prevent him from coming back. Balder is able to calm the serpent down and convince it to let him pass by promising that he will one day be released from hell. And when he does return to the land of the living, he is greeted by a magnificent horse that helps him ride across the sky. So it's not hard to see how the Vikings came to believe that horses could be helpful when journeying through the afterlife. Or it might just have been because they liked horses. Either way, horses weren't the only animals that were sometimes buried with the dead. Dogs were also a popular choice, probably because they were seen as loyal companions. And there have been cases where entire wolf packs have been found buried alongside their human counterparts. This suggests that wolves were either domesticated at some point in prehistory, or that Vikings kept them as pets, just like dogs. But what if you weren't a horse or a dog? Or other animals allowed to be buried with Vikings? Sometimes. The most common animals to receive this honor were birds, presumably because they were seen as messengers between the worlds of the living and the dead. There's also evidence that pigs were sometimes sacrificed and buried with humans, possibly as offerings to the gods, or simply because pigs were valuable resources that shouldn't go to waste. And of course, there are the famous cases of the Oseberg and Gokstad ships, which contained the remains of 2 women and hundreds of animals, including cattle, sheep, goats, chickens, and dogs. But these are all examples of elite burials. What about ordinary people? Well, there is some evidence that even ordinary Vikings sometimes buried their favorite animals with them, even if it wasn't very common. Archaeologists have found small animal bones in graves that don't seem to belong to any livestock. So these may have been pets or just animals that the deceased person liked. Now that we know what some Vikings were buried with, let's talk about how they were buried. Because while burials at sea were common, land burials were usually reserved for important people. And those burials were special. One example is the burial of a woman named Asa, which took place sometime in the late 9th or early 10th century. She was laid to rest in a massive mound near the town of Germanbu in Norway, and she was accompanied by 2 servants who had been killed and buried alive to serve her in the afterlife. Archaeologists have found traces of a feast that took place before the burial, as well as a large number of grave goods, including jewelry, clothing, weapons, and even a loom. Her body was placed in a coffin made of planks, but instead of using nails to hold the coffin together, the Vikings used wooden pegs. This is probably because they believed that if they used iron nails, the dead person would bleed in their sleep and wake up. And that's something that everyone wants to avoid, whether they're alive or dead. But Asa's burial wasn't the only time the Vikings went all out for a funeral. In fact, some of the largest and most elaborate burials in Scandinavia come from the Viking Age. One example is the burial at the Jelling Monument, which features 2 large mounds side by side, each about 45 meters in diameter. Archaeologists believe that these mounds were intended to mark the graves of a king and his 2 wives, as well as several members of his family and retainers. The mounds were surrounded by a moat and a timber fence, and inside the largest mound, archaeologists found a huge longship that had been filled with the bodies of over 30 men, women, and children. The longship was decorated with intricate carvings, including scenes from Norse mythology, as well as inscriptions that tell the story of the burial. This is one of the few cases where archaeologists have found a ship inside a mound, but it's not the only one. There are other examples of burials that have been built in the shape of ships, such as the burial at Illerup in Denmark, which dates back to the 8th century. The burial consisted of a large ship that had been buried in a mound, and it was surrounded by a ring of standing stones. Inside the ship, archaeologists found a number of grave goods, including a cauldron, a tripod, a spindle whorl, and a broken axe. But perhaps the most interesting find was a stone that had been carved with a series of runic inscriptions. The inscriptions tell the story of a man named Herefna, who was probably the person who was buried in the ship. According to the inscriptions, Herefna was a warrior who fought in many battles, and he was also a friend of the legendary Viking Ivar the Boneless. Another interesting feature of the burial is the ring of standing stones that surrounds it. Similar rings have been found at other Viking burial sites, and they may have served as a ritual enclosure or a place where people could gather to perform ceremonies in honor of the dead. So how did the Vikings build these impressive ship burials? Well, the process was fairly simple, though it required a lot of manpower. First, a trench was dug to form the shape of a ship. Then the bottom of the trench was covered with a layer of stone, and then the sides of the trench were filled in with soil. Once the mound was complete, the body or bodies were placed inside and then covered with more soil. Grave goods could also be placed inside the mound, either during or after the burial. Finally, a cairn or ring of stones might be built around the mound to mark the grave. Ship burials were often impressive and elaborate affairs, and they served as a reminder of the importance of the dead person to the community. They were often built on prominent headlands or islands, and they could be seen for miles. The largest and most impressive ship burial ever found dates back to the 9th century and is located at the village of Hedeby in Denmark. The burial mound, known as the Trelleborgen burial, is over 200 meters in diameter and contains the remains of a man and 17 women and children. Archaeologists believe that the burial was intended to commemorate a member of the Danish royal family, but unfortunately, we don't know who exactly was buried there. So there you have it, just two of the craziest death rituals ever practiced by the Vikings. What do you think? Would you want to be buried with your favorite horse, or in a ship made of stone? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more videos about the Vikings and other historical cultures. Thanks for watching.